Hi everyone, so I decided to do my project on Cuba. I went there last December, and so it's a country that's very near and dear to my heart. However, I also think it's super important to talk about Cuba because we're having a lot of political issues with Cuba and how former President Obama relieved the embargo with Cuba, and we started doing trade with them once again. And then Trump is now having a little bit more issues with accepting that relationship back into America's life. And so I think it's important you will actually have a lot more Cuban natives or immigrants, however you like to say it, in your classroom than you would really expect. And I'll explain why later. But the picture in the background is actually one I took with some really old cool Chevys and Fords. So just a little fun fact there. But if you don't know what happened with Cuba and America, this is a very brief history. It's way more in depth. There are tons of documentaries on it. It's pretty interesting if you're a history buff. I got to go to a few of the historical sites when I was there, and it was just so cool to see all of these things that I've learned about and hear their side of the story versus our side. But the basics are Fidel Castro seized private land in the 1960s and started taxing America heavily, and he started increasing trade with Soviet Union. This obviously did not rub America the right way, and so February 7th, 1962, President Kennedy places an embargo on Cuban products. So basically, we could not do any more trade with them. Those companies were pulled out of that private land, and you could no longer bring in any Cuban products or export products to Cuba. When I was in Cuba, however, there was still a lot of American company products, and I was like, how did you get this? The embargo was just released, and basically they would travel to Europe, buy American products, and then bring them back in. So a lot of them had like Apple products and different kinds of cell phones, and they would essentially get them on a black market, bring them back into their states, and then use them. It just shows how far people will go to get an iPhone. But it was just interesting to see all the roundabout ways. They obviously still had like Japanese company cars and things like that, but anything that was from Chevy or Ford was back in a 50s and 60s model. So I included a picture from when I was there. It was really cool to see. A lot of those old cars, the radios, the air conditioning, everything still worked because they hadn't had any other imports, and so they made sure those cars were always working and they were kept in pristine condition. And that's actually kind of a pride that they have in their cars, is that they've kept these models working for so long. So just wanted to include that fun little tidbit and picture, because that's something that Cuba's extremely well known for, because we placed this embargo. And then if there wasn't already some bad blood, the CIA tried to overthrow Castro for a few years. Actually, they just focused on killing him for about 2 years. We tried numerous things, didn't work. Obviously, Castro, he just passed away last year. So it was not a successful mission. But then Kennedy found out about the Cuban missile base that was being created. The Soviet Union placed a missile base in Cuba, and thus created the Cuban Missile Crisis for about 16 days or so. There was a lot of, what do we do? Oh my gosh, what's going on? That's actually the documentary if you want to watch what happened. It's pretty in-depth and actually very interesting. I watched it before I went over because I had no idea what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. I just thought we were fighting with Cuba for no reason. And even though this base was gone in 6 months, there was still a lot of bad blood and trust that was lost. And so we cut all ties with Cuba. And then in the 1980s, Fidel Castro allowed Cubans to leave if they wished. This was a huge deal because actually there was a lot of control over Cuban citizens. And so when he said you can leave, he also told them that if they left, they would no longer be allowed back in as Cuban citizens. When I spoke to families over there, they said that they were able to see their family members that did leave. However, they were just not allowed citizenship again. They weren't allowed to stay. It was kind of like a visitor visa. And there was roundabout ways for them to still come and visit even during the embargo. It was just a lot harder. But roughly 125,000 Cubans landed on the shores of Florida and then were refused to be let back in. America was also super upset about this because they also allowed prisoners and mental institution patients to come over. So it furthered our bad blood with them because we had all of these new citizens that we had to take into account and bring into America. And so that brings me to how it relates to the classroom. So a lot of those people that landed over here mainly in Florida, in the southern part of Florida, however, they have spread out over since. They obviously planted, and they are now U.S. citizens, and so they are part of the ESL students that you will face in your classroom. And ESL students in public schools range from about 9% to 22%. This is obviously higher in bordering states or places such as California and Florida. California actually has the highest ESL rating of 22.4. And these are statistics from 2014 to 2015 school year. During that school year, also, 77.1% of ESL students spoke Spanish. I personally don't speak Spanish, so I think it's really awesome when teachers also minor in Spanish or they take an interest in it, just because you will have so many students, especially in the South or in bordering states, if you plan on moving, that speak Spanish. And it is more common for ESL students to be in an urban setting, more jobs, more opportunities, than if they were in a rural setting where there's less jobs and less reasons for immigrants to move there. But also, just to expect, what to expect with Cuban students in your classroom. Cuban students are most likely to speak Spanish with English as a second language. That is their primary language over in Cuba. And Cubans value education a lot higher than most countries. 98% literacy rating across their country, which I found super impressive. They also, 10% of the nation's budget goes towards their education system. That doesn't sound like a lot, but however, if you think about a whole country's budget, it's a pretty large amount. It is a highly respected thing to continue school. Teachers are actually required to do 5 years minimum of school, and it is a widely respected profession across the country. And when I was over there, pretty much everybody had graduated from their secondary schooling and had gone on to receive higher education. However, the structure of the school is very different and very strict. It is primarily lecture-based. It's very rare if they ever do group projects or student involvement at all. It's extremely lecture-based, and they are not encouraged to be vocal. When I talked about my schooling, they were kind of surprised at how lenient things were and how I was able to just sort of freely study what I wanted and be a part of my learning process. And so I think this is just important to keep in mind if you ever come across a Cuban student, because the household that they are raised in, parents are very involved from what I've heard with their student schooling, and they are also pretty strict on their students, well, on their children as students, in like being on top of their studies and working hard. So I think it's just a good thing to have in context when you're dealing with a Cuban student as an ESL learner. And then I am a art ed person, and so this is an artist that I definitely want to talk about in my art classroom. I'm terrible at names. Tiana. She is an installation and performance artist from Cuba. She's been arrested numerous times. She's been in jail for basically her entire life because she does extremely aggressive pieces of work towards the government, and in Cuba that is just not okay. They obviously, if they aren't allowing you to speak out in a school setting, they are not going to be wildly crazy about you speaking out in a public setting. In 1998, she created The Burden of Guilt, and this is where she sat and she ate dirt and water mixed with dirt, so basically mud, in front of a crowd of people. During this performance, she also had a microphone, and she allowed people to come up and talk for 1 minute about whatever they wanted. Pretty much all of them spoke about freedom and allowing them to have a voice in their society. And this was one of the times, obviously, that she got arrested because it was considered an act of defiance and, her acting against her government and her leaders. But if you are interested in all, I highly encourage you to look her up. She's super cool. And one of the things I really want to bring in, just because it ties in so well with Cuban history and what's going on right now in America, because she's bringing in issues from Cuba's past before Fidel took over, and then also bringing in issues now of power and control. And the piece down below is another one of her installation pieces where she just wore animal carcasses and also ate really grotesque things. She's pretty intense and pretty radical in her activism, and I just want to include this fun little tidbit. And then here are my references. I couldn't find who actually took that photo of Kennedy, but I got it off The Atlantic, which isn't a super credible source, but it is obviously Kennedy in the photo, and it said Getty Images below, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to do a brief cover of Cuba and just some info for y'all to be thinking about how you can handle how you can address these students in your classroom, and also be sensitive to what they've been through, what they're experiencing at home, because it's kind of a different situation than some other immigrants that might be coming in. And just always keeping in mind, you never really know who's walking through your door. You don't really know all their backgrounds. And so, yeah, if y'all have any questions about Cuba or anything about my time there, I would love to answer them. And I hope you enjoyed this and the pictures. Thanks.